Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember to support, subscribe. The other Boleyn girl. Mary Boleyn, mistress to Henry VIII. Mary was, before the rise of her sister Anne, the most famous member of her family. But that honour was a dubious one, as it was solely based on her affair with King Henry VIII. The exact year of Mary's birth has been debated, and there has been some speculation over which sister was actually the oldest. Some historians have settled on Anne being born around 1507 and Mary being born a year later in 1508. They did have another sibling who survived past infancy, and he was called George. Born at Hever Castle, Mary was named after Mary Tudor, the youngest child of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Loyal to the Tudor dynasty, Mary's family also had Yorkist connections. Mary's mother was Elizabeth Howard and her father Thomas Boleyn. Hever Castle had been passed down the generations through Thomas's ancestry, and that is where they lived as a family, raising 3 children within the 10 years after Elizabeth and Thomas married in 1501. Mary's father Thomas had great skill at speaking French, and this led to the opportunity of him becoming one of the 3 envoys that was sent to the Netherlands court. Along with his language skills and his family's connections, he secured the appointment. Once in the Netherlands, he was a great success with the regent, Margaret, Archduchess of Austria, and this is how he managed to secure a prestigious appointment for his eldest daughter Anne. This is the evidence that historians go upon to agree that Anne was the eldest, and as the eldest, she was found to be offered opportunities first. However, that being said, by this point Mary was already married, something that was an unusual occurrence. Mary had married a man called William Carey, a gentleman of the Royal Privy Chamber, on the 4th of February 1520. Although William did not have a title, his duties meant that he had intimate contact with King Henry VIII on a daily basis. William would prove valuable to the Boleyns, as Henry would use his attendants, with whom he would spend his free time with, to carry out government work. A shocking fact, one that even for the Tudor era is stomach-churning, is that William was 24 when he married Mary, but that Mary was only 12 years old. The wedding was held a few weeks before the return of Mary's father, and this indicates that Thomas Boleyn had probably been planning it for some time. Henry VIII gave the newlyweds 6 shillings and 8 pence, and this would have been greatly welcomed by William, a young man who undoubtedly did not have a lot of money himself and lacked his own lands. It is by being in Henry's favour, or more like Mary's affair with Henry, that helped in this respect. Before William died in 1528, he received 2 keeperships and stewardships, an annuity and manors in 2 countries. Mary, being William's wife, had lodgings at court and had access to information about royal policies, as well as the opportunity to participate in all court events. Their first child, Catherine, was born around 1524 when Mary was just 16. Meanwhile, her family continued its ascendancy during these years. She and her sister Anne were 2 of 8 women who participated in a celebration at York Palace, Cardinal Wolsey's home. Anne played perseverance and Mary was kindness. They were clothed in white satin with bejewelled headdresses. This was in 1522, and Mary would have been just 14. By the time she was 17, she was already a first-time mother and Henry VIII's mistress. There is much evidence to support this. In 1527, Henry VIII was planning to marry Mary's sister Anne, and he sought and received a papal dispensation to marry the sister of a woman who he had engaged in an illicit and unlawful intercourse. Anne only had one sister, and that was Mary. It is believed that Reginald Pope reported the following. In 1528, a member of Parliament insulted the king's morals by accusing Henry of sleeping with Anne's mother, Anne's sister. Undoubtedly flustered, the king replied, "Never with her mother." Mary and Henry's affairs were known inside diplomatic circles, and in 1532 Francis I of France, whilst greeting Henry and Anne at Calais, met Mary face to face. He then mentioned her infamous behaviour with her sister's spouse. Henry and Mary's affair was brief and ended in mid-1525. On March the 4th of the following year, Mary gave birth to a boy, and he was named Henry, widely assumed to be the king's son. He also physically resembled Henry VIII, and this was a fact often remarked upon. Another fact debated through history, but perhaps Henry VIII gave away the truth himself. He granted Carey manors and estates during the affair and immediately before the birth of the child. Previously, Carey had only been granted minor offices. Henry VIII had another illegitimate son with Bessie Blount, and he was named Henry Fitzroy, a child that Henry recognised as his own. Perhaps the reason that Mary's Henry wasn't recognised was due to the embarrassment that Henry VIII felt. Acknowledging the child of your fiancé's sister as your own, perhaps that was a step too far for Henry. Henry Carey, Mary's son, was eventually ennobled as Lord Hunsdon by Elizabeth I. She may have been his half-sister, but she was undoubtedly his cousin. But Elizabeth only offered him this title on his deathbed, to which he told her that if the Queen did not think him worth it whilst he was in health, then he would not accept it whilst ill. Now, Mary was referenced in love letters that Henry VIII sent to Anne in 1528, the year that Mary's husband died. William had asked Mary to seek Anne's influence with the king. William's sister, Eleanor, wanted to be given the position of abbess at St. Edith's nunnery, where the nuns wanted their prioress elevated instead. Ultimately, it was Eleanor's dubious morals that destroyed her chances, but this shows the lengths that Mary was willing to go to as she felt she could benefit from her sister's closeness with the king. After the death of Mary's husband, Henry VIII granted Anne wardship of Henry Carey, Mary's son. It is believed that both Anne and Henry felt that Mary's behaviour was degenerate and that her easy virtue could become something of an issue, and she would possibly become an embarrassment to the king and his new wife. It is even believed that Henry gave Anne £20 to redeem a jewel from Mary, possibly a gambling debt. Mary, 2 years later, accompanied both Anne and Henry to France in the Field of the Cloth of Gold, and they all stayed in Calais in the late October. They attended various events with Francis I, celebrating a peace agreement. This was also a chance to present Anne to a foreign king. Mary was Anne's lady-in-waiting, and it wasn't until 1534 that the pair began to have serious conflict. In 1534, Mary then secretly married William Stafford. Mary married William for her own personal happiness, but her high-born family were outraged. She had married a commoner, and that was not good enough for the sister of the Queen. Mary loved William, a man she had met in Calais. He was a soldier as part of King Henry's retinue, and Mary's family were hoping to marry her off to a nobleman. But her marriage for love was a step back for them socially. Therefore, Mary was banished from court. In late 1543, when Mary's father and brother received titles and other gifts, Mary found herself asking Thomas Cromwell if he would help her. She begged him to speak with Henry on her behalf, but Henry was no help. She had hoped that he would persuade Anne to forgive her, but alas, he did not. So instead, Mary asked Cromwell if he would speak with her father, brother and uncle. Henry Carey, Mary's son, was still at this time living with Anne, and he was being tutored by the French poet Nicholas Bourbon. He was definitely benefiting from the wardship. After this point, it is then difficult to trace Mary's life, up until the point of her sister's execution in 1536. It is thought that she lived at Rochford in Essex from the time of her disgrace until the time of her death on the 19th of July 1543. Mary was again mentioned at court when her sister Anne was disgraced and Henry was looking to divorce her. But Mary did not visit her sister when she was imprisoned in the Tower, nor did she write to her or their brother George, both who were sentenced to death. Maybe Mary felt that, like her uncle the Duke of Norfolk, that it was wise to avoid association with disgraced relatives. Mary lived long enough to see her children gain some royal favour. Her daughter Catherine, who was born in 1524, became the maid of honour for Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife. And then, sometime in 1540, Catherine made a good match, marrying Sir Francis Knollys, a popular member of Henry VIII's household. She also became one of Elizabeth Tudor's closest friends, who also happened to be her cousin. Catherine's daughter, Lettice Knollys, would then go on to marry Elizabeth's great love, Robert Dudley. Henry Carey, Mary's son, would then be ennobled in Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth was always kind to her Boleyn relatives, especially the children of Mary. 22 years after the execution of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, a Boleyn would be the sole ruler of England, something that few would have predicted. So, Mary, who was considered more beautiful than Anne, was taught French as a child by Mademoiselle Semonette, and she studied music, learning to play a variety of instruments. She first spent time in the service of Archduchess Margaret, but was then removed by her father and placed into the service of Catherine of Aragon. Although Mary had a brother and a sister, they reportedly didn't have much time for her, and she was always the odd one out of the three, as Anne and George were close. Mary's life, although she may have found love during the end, was actually rather sad. She had her son taken away from her after the death of her first husband, and she was used by her family to enable them to rise in society. Was it Mary's influence with Mary Tudor that enabled Anne to become the second wife of Henry VIII? If Anne wasn't brought into court as a lady-in-waiting for Catherine of Aragon, Henry may have never set eyes on her, and history as we know it could have been very different. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.